Atheist Alliance International Podcast.
I don't make this stuff up.
You know, if you put Jesus Christ first, that he'll look after all your bills.
It's not fake, it's faith.
Hello and welcome to the latest episode of the Atheist Alliance International Podcast. I'm your host, Jason Sylvester. Just before we get started, I'd like to remind everyone to please like and subscribe. And this week we're joined by Tim Sledge, an ex-Baptist minister and a writer and now an atheist, prolific atheist on Twitter. And he's here to tell us about his life. So thank you for joining us, Tim.
Thank you, Jason. I'm glad to be here today.
Yeah. So as I mentioned, you are a former Baptist minister, now an atheist and a writer. So maybe you can just kick us off by just introducing yourself to our viewers and tell us a little bit about your life as a pastor and then how you came to be an atheist.
Sure. Well, I was born in Austin, Texas, and we started moving around right away. And the reason for that was my father was an alcoholic. He was a great dad in so many ways. I wrote a tribute to him on Facebook yesterday for Father's Day. He's deceased now. But he was a binge alcoholic. So our family life would be great for a month, 2-3 months, and then suddenly everything fell apart. I knew if I walked home from school and my dad's car was crooked in the driveway, it wasn't going to be good. That uncertainty led to, I'm just surmising this, but I think the reason we moved around a lot is that he'd get in trouble, something would happen. So by the time I was 8 years old, we were living in the West Texas town of Snyder, and we were going to the Avenue D Baptist Church. In my Sunday school class, they gave us a Bible, everybody a Bible, and it was great. Black, gold letters on the front. And in the back of this Bible, there was a plan by which you could read the whole Bible in 1 year. And so I decided as an 8-year-old boy, that's my New Year's resolution. I'm going to read the Bible. And I started. Old Testament in the morning, New Testament at night. I stuck with it. When summer came, our little Baptist church had Vacation Bible School. And that's where Baptists, they need to get their children right with God because, we're all really big sinners and we're going to hell. So, but that's not exactly how it was presented, but that was the bottom line. So Vacation Bible School, we had games and crafts and fun and Bible stories. But on Thursday, the pastor got us all into the auditorium or sanctuary and gave us an evangelistic message. He talked about how much God loved us and God sent his only son, Jesus, to die for our sins. And that if we would give our lives to Jesus, everything would be good. That's what we needed to do. And that's what my Sunday school teacher, Mr. Reed, had been telling us every week. I knew I needed to do it. I'd been struggling with it, and I struggled that day, but I walked the aisle, and that day I gave my life to Jesus. That was the beginning. And I was very sincere. Everything I understood about it, everything I was told to do, I did it. And a few days later, I was baptized in the Baptist church. You're immersed all the way in the water, and it's a symbol of your new life in Christ. Later, we moved to Odessa, Texas, which is the home of the Friday Night Lights School, Permian High School. That's where I went to school. And we were in a larger church with a very dynamic pastor. And when I was 16, we were having a revival service. And one night I walked the aisle and my decision was, God is calling me to be a minister. I preached my first sermon about 2 weeks later. And the next thing I knew, I was preaching in different churches around West Texas almost every week. Not just Baptist churches, Methodist, Assembly of God, different kinds. And then in my junior year, the school counselor called me to her office, and I don't remember what all we talked about, but then she said, Tim, I think you ought to run for student body president. And I said, I don't think so. I don't think anybody even knows me that much, And she says, no, I think you should do it. So she talked me into it. And not long after that, I was giving a speech to the 2,000 students at this large West Texas high school. And in it, I talked about my Christian commitment. And right after that, there was the vote, and the announcement came over the PA system. I had won. Interestingly, that year, I was the president. The vice president was a friend named Jay, who was an atheist, a Jewish atheist. And then the secretary was a Catholic. So we had a Baptist, a Jewish atheist, and a Catholic. Again, I later in my senior year, I organized a Billy Graham style youth rally at our local Coliseum. And 1,200 people showed up. We had about 50 young people who came and committed their lives to Jesus that night. So I was on a roll. I was, God has called me, and I'm going to serve God. I started out my college in Abilene, Texas at Hardin-Simmons University, a Baptist school. But my dad, near the end of the first semester, he said, I can't afford this. So I went back home, went to junior college, got married, and we ended up at Wheaton College in Wheaton, Illinois, through the help of some people in our church and a lot of grants and loans at the school. We packed up our trailer with our furniture and pulled it on up to 1,200 miles to Wheaton, Illinois, just outside of Chicago. And that was a really exciting time. At Hardin-Simmons, my Old Testament textbook was written by Samuel J. Schultz. At Wheaton, I was sitting in a class with about 5 other students, and the teacher was Samuel J. Schultz. While I was there, I sat 10 feet away from Billy Graham as he delivered the chapel message one day, and I just couldn't believe I was sitting there. And I met some people, some close friends of mine, Philip Yancey, who Billy Graham later said was his favorite Christian author. Philip and his wife and my wife and I shared a rental house. And another good friend was Steve Bell, who ended up on the staff of one of the top 3 churches in the country, just outside of Chicago. His pastor was Bill Hybels. And so it was an exciting time, a tremendous time. I decided to go back to Texas for my theological education. So I went to Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary, which at the time was the largest Protestant seminary in the United States, maybe the world. I don't know. But I got my master's degree and then my doctorate of ministry. And while I was a student there, I was called to be youth minister at a church in Memphis, Tennessee. We would live there in the summers and then alternately fly or drive from Fort Worth to Memphis during the school year. One of the things that happened there is key to what ultimately happened to me. And it was one of many what I call exceptions to the rule of faith. These had started almost immediately. Like when I was back in West Texas, I preached a summer youth revival. And during the revival, we had an invitation at the end of the service. And a guy came forward, a young man, and everybody said, "Oh my goodness, we can't believe he came forward. This is incredible. This is amazing." And so I was excited about that. And the same church had me back a year later for another revival. And I don't remember the guy's name. Let's say his name was Bill. And one of the first things I said when I got there was, "Well, where's Bill? How's Bill doing?" And they said, "Who?" "Bill, Bill." "Oh, who?" "Bill, the guy who had that dramatic conversion." They said, "Oh, he came for a couple of weeks and we never saw him again." Well, that was really discouraging to me because I believe the scripture when it said, "If anyone is in Christ, he is a new creation. The old has passed away. Behold, all things have become new." I believe the writing of the Apostle Paul, who said, "It is not I who live now, but Christ who lives in me." It was conversion. It was what Billy Graham, the great evangelist of the day, talked about. And it's what evangelicals believed in. But that was one of my first experiences of seeing that, well, this conversion thing, it's a little more complicated than I first thought. And my response, though, was, well, Tim, you need to learn more, get more experience. You'll be able to figure this out later. And I just sort of put it in my back pocket. An exception to the rule of faith. Well, okay, back to Memphis, Tennessee. This was about 2 years after Martin Luther King had been assassinated at the Lorraine Hotel in Memphis. The students in my youth group, some of them remembered watching army tanks roll down their streets to deal with the riots that followed his death. I got to where I played a game. When I got off the plane in Memphis, I played a game with myself, not a really funny or fun game, but I would note how long it took to observe some overt example of racial tension in that city where it was about half black and about half white. So while I was there, I started a ministry called Dial-A-Teen. My master's and doctoral work at the seminary, I majored in pastoral care because, well, I think one thing that was going on is I was already looking for ways to make this thing work better. And so I was real interested in counseling and helping people. This Dial-A-Teen ministry, well, I trained some teenagers to talk to kids about, if they were struggling with their self-confidence or feeling suicidal or whatever was going on. Our young people talked to them, and they did so with love. And it wasn't just like trying to, get them to pray to receive Christ, although that was one of our goals. So it was real successful. TV stations, radio stations in the city gave us free advertising. Lots of teenagers called in on the weekends, and well, the telephone was no discerner of skin color, so everybody called in, including African American youths, and our young people talked to them and helped them, and we always invited the kids who called to our youth events, and pretty soon 2 African American girls who we had reached out to on Dial-A-Teen showed up at a swimming party in a suburban home of one of our church members. During that swimming party, which seemed to be going great, I got a phone call from the dad of 2 of the girls in our youth group. And I won't use the word he used, but he said, I understand you've got some, bad word there at the party. And I said, no, we don't have any of those, but there's a couple of African American girls here, yeah. And he was furious. He was furious at my response. He came and got his daughters. And along around that same time, our pastor was he was more liberal within Southern Baptist life, if you can grasp that. But he was very pro race relations, and he was outspoken in Memphis about that. But someone had discovered that our weekday preschool did not accept African American children. A prominent family, black family, had tried to get their daughter admitted, and they were rejected and were told this is our policy. A newspaper reporter found out about it on a Saturday morning. A big story. It may have been on the front page, if not the front page, on one of the section front pages. And it targeted our church for hypocrisy. And it said that the NAACP was going to picket our church the next day. An emergency deacons meeting was called. The pastor was out of town at a conference in New Mexico, decided not to come back. That kind of surprised me. And so as I was going to the deacons meeting that day, I grabbed a handful of tracts that we used in our Dial-A-Teen ministry about race relations. It was positive. Everybody's a child of God. Everybody's the same. And I thought those might come in handy during the discussion. But when I got to the deacons meeting, it wasn't anything like what I expected. Some of the older deacons seemed especially upset. And I heard one of them utter under his breath something about he'd like to kill somebody. He was worried they were going to come inside the church. The younger deacons were better. I think their approach was more like, okay, they just wanted to get the older guys calmed down and just sort of deal with the crisis and move on. But what I learned that day was nobody wanted to look at the pamphlets I had that quoted Bible verses about equality. This was a cultural thing. And so once again, I was faced, but this time with a huge exception to the rule of faith. These men, these were deacons elected as lay members who are to be spiritual leaders. They all had not only professed that Jesus had come into their lives and changed them, they were supposed to be a cut above the average. But a few of them were, but many of them were not. So that was one more exception to the rule of faith. My next church was my first full-time church in a suburb of New York City. I was so excited. My wife and I were so excited about living there and being there. Just so much happening there. And so we were at the seminary moving. We got a professional moving truck, loaded up our belongings, and 2,500 miles to a suburb of New York City in northern New Jersey. When we got there, the mover said that they needed a check for $2,500, which we didn't have. But no worries, the church is going to pay for this. So I called the chairman of our pastor search committee, and he called the treasurer, but the treasurer said, no, we didn't vote for that. We didn't vote to pay the moving expenses. Fortunately, a kind deacon wrote a personal check and paid the movers, but what I found out later is that the treasurer was mentally disturbed. He needed psychological help, and somebody had said earlier, I think it'd make him feel better if we made him treasurer, because he was an accountant. I spent the next 2 years as pastor of that small church dealing with a mentally ill man in my congregation that when we finally addressed it and asked him to leave, one lady told me, "I'm afraid he's going to come up here and kill some of us." If anyone is in Christ, he is a new creation. Doesn't sound like that. And then there was a guy who showed up one day. He and his wife showed up. They were having a hard time. And he had actually appeared on there was this giant ad campaign back in those days in the 70s for a particular brand of cigarette. And their slogan was, "I'd rather fight than switch." And they had all these one-page ads in the major magazines and newspapers with somebody with a black eye because they were fighting rather than switching their cigarette brand. And this guy had been on one of those ads all over the United States, but now his life he was crushed. I talked to him, tried to show love to him, and I shared Jesus with him, as that's what we did, and he prayed to invite Jesus into his life. About 2 months later, he robbed a bank, and I went to visit him in Sing Sing prison. That's where the phrase "up the river" comes from. It's up the Hudson River from New York City. Well, that's another exception to the rule of faith. I served another church in Arizona, and then I ended up in the 80s back in my home state in Houston, Texas, at a church that, well, it just seemed like I'd finally found the perfect place for me. And I wanted so badly to lead a church to really grow. And that's what happened. In the 10.5 years I was there, the church quadrupled in size. We reached about 2,000 in membership. And perhaps the most significant thing that happened there, both to me and to the church, was, and going back to my story of my dad and his alcoholism, my dad, by the way, got much better. He made a lot of progress, which was a good thing. Alcoholism ran all through my father's side of the family, including my cousin. We'd been close growing up. I'd go spend time with him in the summer. And then as we went our separate ways as adults, we hadn't talked for, I don't know, maybe 15 years. But when I was in Arizona, I found that he was at a treatment center in Wickenburg, the Meadows, about an hour from where I lived. And so I went to see him, and we reconnected. He got sober, and became a leader in the 12-step program in AA in Austin, Texas, where he lived. And over the years, he would tell me, hey, Tim, the Meadows, where you visited me, they've got a program for ministers where they want ministers to come just to see what they do. And you can go there for free. I never wanted to go. I never had any reason to think I should go. But in 1988, I decided I was going to do a series of sermons on adult children of alcoholics. Suddenly, books were coming out all over the place about this topic. And so I decided I would do a sermon series. And I thought, well, what better way to prepare for this sermon series than to go to the Meadows, like my cousin suggested. So I did. I found myself on a Monday morning in a group of about 8 people. Everybody else was either an alcoholic, a drug addict, a sex addict, or something that was alien to my personal lifestyle. After listening to the raw honesty and the intense emotional pain in that group for one morning, my reaction was, I need to get out of here. I am not like any of these people. And I think I was disturbed by the level of honesty in there. It was disarming. But I'm not a quitter, and I didn't walk away. I stayed. And during the week, I came to understand, emotionally, I am like these people. I do have some of the same emotional issues. And I see now that these issues are growing out of the fact that I grew up in a home with an alcoholic. I had a real intense experience that week. I learned about shame. I learned that sometimes the children of addicts and alcoholics take on the shame of the parent. And man, I had so much more than just sermon material. My life has changed. And I found myself wondering, why did I have to go to a secular treatment center to find out these powerful things that I learned there? I didn't think much about it. I preached my sermon series, and in the series, I was more honest than I'd ever been. I'd been having panic attacks in the months leading up to this, and I talked about that. I was honest about it. I became very vulnerable. A few weeks into the series, the religion editor of the Houston Chronicle came and did a story on it. And after that, even more people came, people from all over the city, people from other kinds of churches. And at the beginning of that series, I had said, I want to do a support group. I need about 6 people who would join me in getting together every week during this 12-week sermon series or 13-week sermon series. And we're going to talk about these things. I wanted just, I felt like if I had 6 people, that'd be enough. Well, sign up night, we had enough people for 6 groups, around 60 people. Fortunately, I had other staff who could help me lead the groups. And we did it again in the summer and in the fall. The people just kept coming, and our church grew so that we had sort of a congregation within the congregation. We had people whose stories and whose lives weren't squeaky clean. There was a lot of brokenness in their past. But I began to say, this is a healing church for hurting people. I wrote 6 different books to be used in these support groups. They were published by Southern Baptist, and I started traveling a lot, telling other churches. I spoke at nationwide conferences for Southern Baptist, talking about support groups and how powerful they could be. It was surprising how much support I got from my own denomination, actually. But then in late 1995, I'd been there a little over 10 years. The personnel committee of the church came to me and they said, Tim, we want you to resign. And I was like, what? There were no ethical charges. There were no, it was not about, well, you did something wrong. It wasn't that. I said, well, what is the matter? And they said, well, just some people aren't happy with your leadership. I was burned out. I've been traveling, writing, just going 90 miles an hour. And it's like they knew just when to strike. And after listening to them for a while, I was like, you know what? if you can do as well as I've done in a job and be asked and be fired, basically, I don't want to do this anymore. And so I acquiesced. There was a business meeting on a Wednesday night, and I got up and talked for a few minutes. And when I finished, about 80% of the people gave me a standing ovation for about 2 minutes. And that's when I understood that I had been tricked, railroaded. I really didn't think there were that many people against me, but by then I didn't want to stay. And so I left. Now, I didn't leave my faith. I started doing a 5-day-a-week Christian radio program, a talk show in Houston. I started working for our Baptist Counseling Center there in Houston. I did both of those things for about a year, and then for different reasons, I unable to make enough money, and in the radio and the counseling, I just that wasn't what I was cut out for. Although I have a lot of respect for people who do that, it wasn't my thing. I tried other things. I got involved in a company called FlashNet that was one of the first companies selling dial-up internet access at a reduced price. And after about 3 years, I ended up as their #1 distributor in the nation with other people under me selling internet. The one thing we didn't see coming was high-speed internet, and that's where the phone companies came in, and so that ended that endeavor. What I ended up doing was writing software for businesses, and that's something that I still do. I kept going to church. My wife was a children's minister, and she actually ended up on the staff of another church. And so I would go and listen. I still had invitations to speak at different places. And this went on for about 5 years. And then some things happened in my life. I left my marriage, and I had never done anything like that. It's the first time I'd ever engaged in a major rule break for my value system as a Christian. I won't go into all the reasons or all the things that happened. I explain this more detail in my book, Goodbye Jesus. But I ended up very broken, not arrogant, broken. And I had moved to Fort Worth, where I'd gone to seminary, and I started looking for a church, not a church where I could be any kind of leader, but a church in the Christian community. They talk about restoration when you, as a minister, you've fallen. I knew I couldn't be a minister again in my own set of values that I'd followed all my life. I was no longer qualified, but I just wanted a church home. I wanted to get back to feeling that I was in fellowship with God and I had a community, and I would try one place after another. And again, I go into more detail in my book, but everywhere I went, there was some obstacle. I think I scared some of the pastors. Some of these churches were smaller, and they just didn't. It was too much for them to handle all that had happened to me, and this went on for quite a while. I would say a year, maybe 2. But every time I would go, with my hopes, okay, I'm going to find my place again. And sometimes it would take a day, sometimes it would take weeks. And I finally just said, you know what, I'm not going to church anymore. It's too painful. And it was just kind of a survival thing at that point. So when I stopped going to church, an interesting thing happened. It was like I had these blinders on, or special glasses, that I looked through, which I looked at everything. And those came off, whatever you want to call them. It all came off. And I started thinking more freely. about the things that I believed. And one of the first things that it's sort of been in the forefront of my mind anyway, I had some friends who had children who'd grown up and come out as gay, and I'd known these kids almost all of their lives. So one of the first steps I took outside of my little walled in place in my mind was I said, I don't think people decide to be gay. I think it's more complicated than that. I think they're born that way. Maybe other things affect it, but it's not just a choice. It's certainly not a sin. It was a big thing for me to say. And then not long after that, I said, you know what? I don't see how a loving God could send anybody to hell. That's just crazy. I don't believe in hell. And it wasn't long after that I was just a given at this point. The Bible is not without error. The Bible has errors in it. You can't trust it. This was stretching out. This was like a snail's pace almost. And I think it was 2008. I wish I'd have written down the date. But remember Jay, the VP at Permian High School? We'd stayed friends all those years, and he lived in Fort Worth area also. And I said, Jay, let's have lunch. We met with some good old Texas barbecue. We start talking. I said, Jay, I don't believe in Jesus anymore. I don't believe in God anymore. I mean, I literally almost had to pull him off the floor. I tried to witness to him for Jesus so many times. Never mean, we always stayed friends, and he'd always resisted. That day, I apologized to Jay for the arrogance of my position, something I'd never seen before. I never saw myself as arrogant. I tried to be kind and humble. But now I saw the arrogance of asking somebody else, telling somebody else, you really need to think like I do on this, or if you don't, you'll be sorry. So for the next 10 years, I was an atheist. I'd become an atheist. My family knew, my friends knew, and but that was about it. If somebody asked me, I would tell them. And in 2018, I was looking at kind of my whole direction and what I want to do with the rest of my life, and I decided I wanted to write again. And I decided, because I'd had experiences of meeting people and getting acquainted with people, and it would just come up. I'd say, well, I used to be a minister, but I wouldn't just jump to saying I was an atheist, but I'd say I don't go to church anymore, and I don't believe any of that anymore. And they would frequently say, that's so interesting. How did that happen? So that made me think that, well, maybe people would be interested in my story. So I wrote Goodbye, Jesus. And on Easter of 2018, at the Houston Secular Community, Houston Oasis, I had my coming out speech as an atheist. And I talked about my story. Since then, I've written other books, and I've been online on Twitter, and I've met so many people, so many like-minded people with stories like mine. And, there's so many things out there. I guess it's worse online about atheists, but I'll tell you, the atheists I know, by and large, are kind, thoughtful, smart. Many of them very smart. And so that's my community now. And that's my story.
Great. Well, thank you for sharing that with us. So, just a couple quick questions. I was making some notes while you were talking. So you mentioned you started preaching. You were still a teenager in high school when you were preaching.
Yes.
So is that something, I think you and I mentioned, we were chatting before. I interviewed David Olivero about a year or two ago, and I think he was mentioning the same thing, that he was a teenager is preaching. Is this something that's common in Southern Baptist churches or in the Bible Belt itself to have teen preachers?
Well, it depends. It's not real common, but it depends on your denomination. And I think David, I know, was Pentecostal. David's a good friend of mine. He's a good guy. So I'll just speak for the Baptist Church. A lot of people don't realize this, but every Baptist church is independent. They own their own building. Their connection to the Southern Baptist Convention is basically they use the Southern Baptist Convention literature for their Bible classes, and they sort of tithe some of their money, send it to the Southern Baptist Commission to support whatever it does, and the big emphasis is on foreign mission work. So each local church decides there are two things you do. You can license a minister in Texas, and that allows you to do weddings. And then you ordain the minister. And you can do that whenever you want. There are no requirements for education. So, I mean, one thing it does mean that there's a huge variety of kinds of people who are ministers. But for most churches of any size in the Southern Baptist Convention, the minister has most likely been to college and has a 3-year master's degree from the seminary, but he probably started preaching many years before that.
It seems a little odd that I would think in most other denominations, and I'm not an expert, but I would assume that the minister is someone who's been to divinity school and has graduated and did not start preaching as a teenager. They maybe participated. Like, I grew up in a Protestant church in Canada, and I would do Bible readings, but, I certainly never gave a sermon or preached. So.
And it was possible. I don't know. I wouldn't say it was that common. I mean, Odessa, my hometown, had probably 70,000 people at the time. And I think I was the only person doing what I was doing, or maybe I was just more visible. I don't know. So, but it was possible. It was possible. And oh my gosh, the adults loved it. I had one friend who, whenever he wanted to go anywhere, we were in high school, his mother would always, give him all these questions. Well, where are you going? Blah, blah, blah. But he learned that if he said he was going with me, like, no questions. Okay, that's good. Because this is what the parents wanted their kids to be. And it was I wasn't doing it for ego, but man, it was a trip. It was, I was admired. I mean, the West Texas culture at that time, probably still is, Baptist was the largest group. And that was there was the cultural power of religion can be very strong, and it was there.
Yeah, definitely right in the buckle of the Bible Belt. Right?
Yeah, that's right.
So, and you mentioned a couple of names when you were at Wheaton, but I know that Professor Bart Ehrman also went to Wheaton. You didn't mention him, but any chance that you guys were there at the same time, or you maybe met him?
He was there a few years after I was, but one of my bucket list things is to meet Bart Ehrman. I studied under the same Greek professor he did, not as illustriously by any means, but yeah. And I would say one thing I didn't mention in my story, I left. What was the primary thing? And a lot of people say, well, you just got your feelings hurt. I'll tell you, when you're a pastor, you get your feelings hurt all the time. You got to be tough. But what happened at my last church was very painful. But I didn't stop being a Christian because of that. It was 10 years later, more than 10 years later, when I left my faith, and I hung in there for a long time. But all those things that happened did make me start thinking more openly about what it was I really believed. And so it was like, okay, this doesn't work as advertised. And I knew about discipleship. You're supposed to train people, make disciples and all that. But no, it was more than that. I felt that when you step back and looked at it honestly, your average church, they're humans. There's some people who are super good. There's some people who are rotten. A lot of people in the middle are good old regular human beings. But I walked away saying there's no supernatural element here. Well, having left it all, and I really didn't do this in a methodical way until I wrote Goodbye Jesus leading up to 2018. And the question was, well, what do I think about Jesus? Who do I think he was? And that's where Bart Ehrman came in. His book, How Jesus Became God, and whatever that I read or listened to that he wrote or said affected my reconditioned view of Jesus more than any other source. And I still, I have a lot of admiration for him. So I hope to meet him someday.
Yeah, I'd like to meet him too. When I first started down my road of, being involved in atheism, and I was researching, and some of his books, Jesus, Apocalyptic Prophet, was probably one of the first ones I read. So, and I think this was before he really became super famous. So I had actually emailed him, and he replied, and we corresponded a little bit. But excuse me, I have a cold. Apologize to our viewers. But I think now he's so popular, and he just gets buried, and he doesn't really have time to communicate with people the way he used to.
Yeah.
So, but I've got 2 or 3 of his books on my shelf, and I refer to them quite often. So, but you're a lot closer to him than you're in Texas. He's in North or South Carolina.
North Carolina, I think. Yeah.
North Carolina. Yeah. Cool. Yeah, and you said you weren't qualified. Now, did you mean that in a terms, like, because obviously you said you had a master's in pastoral care, but I think what you meant was you weren't qualified because of the experience you went through. Am I correct in that interpretation?
Refresh my. Okay, you're referring. What did I say?
You mentioned something about you were. I think it was when you were saying you were looking for a church to be a member, but not to preach, because you said you qualified.
Okay. The New Testament, if you take it literally, says that a minister should not be divorced, and I was divorced, and so that's what I was saying. But I mean, there were occasionally in Baptist life you would run into some ministers who had been divorced and they were still in the ministry. But for me, it was just like I'm not going to try to do that anymore. I mean,
So it's more a personal conviction that you weren't qualified, because obviously you had the educational and the experience.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Great. So have you got any new books coming out, or something you're working
on? Well, my newest book is Leaving Faith, Holding On, Letting Go, Looking Back, and Moving Forward. And it's kind of a series of sort of like journal entries that's kind of a shorthand form of describing my journey. After Goodbye Jesus, I wrote 4 disturbing questions with one simple answer, and it's 4 really simple arguments against belief in God and belief in Christianity. Right now, and one of the most recent things I've done through all this writing and interacting, one of the people I met is David Madison, who is a writer who lives in New York City. And I recently worked with him in editing and publishing his book, 10 Things Christians Wish Jesus Hadn't Said. And that is a great book. And it's something I think, I don't have any way of knowing for sure, but I think a lot of Christians are reading it because it's pretty much straight Bible stuff. And one example, one of the 10 things would be, Jesus taught if somebody asks you to borrow some money, you should always say yes. I don't think I know any Christians who do that. So the book is about things that Jesus clearly said, but hardly any Christians do. And David and I are working on another book right now. It's a rewrite of a book he wrote in 2016. And the first one that should be coming out in about the next month deals with reasons why we can't really trust the Bible as divine revelation, why we can't trust the Gospels. And I'd have to say, Jason, that part of my experience, because I still, part of it's because the writing I do, it leads to further study, and I watch a lot of things on YouTube, and it's like with every passing week, I look back at what I used to believe, and I think, man, how did I believe? How did I let myself do that? Because
I think that's a pretty common feeling for a lot of ex-believers.
Yeah. Because it's just so clear that, for example, the Gospels there are so many problems, and you could take a dozen guys who spent their whole lives guys like Bart Ehrman, but not as successful and well known as him. Put them all in a room, and what are they going to do? They're going to argue because it's not clear. We can't know. And the thing that I keep coming back to is this really the best, for the sake of argument, a God who made this universe and who therefore could be considered the inventor of communication itself? Is the Bible the best he could do? It just doesn't add up. I don't think so. Yeah,
there's lots of problems, lots of contradictions, even though the evangelicals claim that there aren't. I came across one, I'll be posting one of my memes tomorrow. There's a verse in 1 Corinthians 14 about speaking in tongues. And yet, what do Pentecostals do? They speak in tongues. I'm like, well, obviously these Pentecostals haven't read the Bible. So,
yeah, that's one of my good friends from high school ended up on the staff of Oral Roberts University, and it caused us to kind of grow apart over the years because our views were so different on that same book that we both said we loved and we believed in.
No, it's definitely, I think for people who've examined it critically, come to the same conclusion we do. But unfortunately, people who won't pull at that thread, I think I've speculated in the past, they know there's something wrong, but they won't pull at that thread because it will unravel their whole life. Everything that they think about themselves, their core belief, would just unravel, and they're just unwilling to go there.
Yeah, I think one of the things I try to keep in mind as I post on Twitter and write is that there's so many varieties of Christianity, and within each variety, every person is different. So, some people, I think they just don't really think deeply about much of anything, and they're actually pretty happy about what they believe, and because their exposure is so limited, they're in a bubble and they don't even know there are problems. And then you're also sort of commissioned. Well, that's not a good word. You're preconditioned, and it's reinforced over and over. It's like a magic act. Look over here. Don't look over there. And you do it so long, it's like it's just natural.
Yeah. Well, that's why there's people like us out there. So, and I think, like, my friends who've teased me that I can be more dogmatic than the faith believers, and I'm like, no, I think I want people to understand. If they're going to believe something, they should understand it and not just regurgitate something. They should think about it critically, especially if they're going to devote their life to it and subsume their critical thinking. And I actually got one of my friends who's always teasing me about, being very dogmatic. I got an email a couple of weeks ago from someone who thanked me for, he was struggling with his faith, and, that it helped him to know that there's other people out there who had struggled with their faith and that have looked critically at these beliefs. And it was helpful to him. And so I forwarded that email to my friend who's always teasing me. So, like, you call me, you tease me that I'm dogmatic, and I'm more dogmatic than like an evangelical preacher, but this is why I do it, because I can reach people and I can help people.
Yeah. That is a good point. And I think that, well, I would say that one of the reasons I write and one of the reasons I'm online expressing these views is just what you said, to help people who are struggling and to help them know that they're not alone, and maybe give them some things to think about, and also to help the people that have already made the decision but have been shunned and feel alone.
Exactly.
Yeah. So I think that's pretty important.
Yeah. And I've made the point several times, like, I know full well I'm not going to convert any hardcore believer.
Right.
But there's a lot of people out there that are sitting on the fence and they're kind of waffling, and I'm just going to give them that little nudge. So.
Yeah, in the United States, the statistics are showing that there is a trend away from belief. They're not necessarily all becoming atheists, but they are moving away from religion, and so that's something that is just what, regardless of what we do, I think it's happening. Yeah, I just think this, and I see it almost every week on Twitter with the people I interact with. There is a sense of gratitude for being able to have other people who are like-minded. And some people say, well, you left faith. Why are you still talking about it? Well, I'm kind of like the guy who drove down the road and saw the bridge was out, and I'm back and I'm trying to flag cars down and say, hey, don't go down there. It's dangerous.
Yeah.
But I agree with you, Jason. I don't ever expect somebody who's happy in their faith or they're committed. I'm not going to change their mind. It's almost like something has to happen in your life that jars you. That's what happened to me. And especially if you've been doing it a long time.
Yeah. Was that good line? You can't reason somebody out of something they didn't reason themselves into. So I think that's kind of what you expressed. They need to have some experiential thing happen to them that alters their thinking or sparks something that starts them down that road of thinking. They're not going to get there, just by listening to our arguments. So
I can't remember the guy's name, but he was, I think, street epistemology is what he did or does. And I think this line was from him. He would ask a person a question. What could you tell me? What could you learn or what could happen to you that would make you stop believing? And if the answer is absolutely nothing, then it's kind of like, well, okay, nice to see you. Have a nice day. I mean, there's not really much of anything to talk about when you're in that mode. And I know because I've been there. I lived that for a long time.
Yeah, I always have an exchange. Last week, I think, I've been doing some videos on the book I'm working on, and I presented 2 books from Bart Ehrman was one of them. I had 6 or 7 books that I cited from, that I was citing quotes and scholarship from. And this person was questioning me. He says, well, you're just quoting some random people on the internet. I'm like, these are professors from Oxford and Cambridge and Bart Ehrman. These are not random people off the internet. And he's like, well, I prefer to believe, what the apologists say. And I'm like, well, then there's no point talking to you.
Yeah. Yeah.
If you're going to say that 2 scholars from Oxford, Bart Ehrman, another guy, I can't remember all of them. Richard
Carrier is another one.
It's like if I'm quoting scholars and you're just denigrating them as people, random people off the internet, then this is a pointless conversation. So, okay, great. Well, thank you for joining us today, Tim. So we'll put some links in the description. So if anybody's looking for Tim's his pages or his books, you can look in the description and they'll be there. Excuse me once again. So we'd like to remind everybody to like and subscribe. And Tim, any parting thoughts before we go?
Just thank you for having me. It's been good to be able to share, and I appreciate it. Thank you.
You're welcome. Well, thank you for coming on and telling us about your journey. So, okay. Right. Well, we'll wrap it up, and we'll see everybody on the next show. Take care. Bye-bye.
Okay, thanks for listening, and don't forget we're on YouTube, so follow us on YouTube. Just search for Atheist Alliance International, and please subscribe and hit that notification bell. We're also on all of your favourite podcast platforms, so make sure that you follow us on there as well. See you next time.